Good evening. My name is Jørgen Sejersted, and as chair of the Holberg board appointed by the University of Bergen, it is my great privilege to welcome you to this event in Litteraturhuset, Oslo. Please allow me a few words in promotion of the Holberg Prize first. The portfolio of the Holberg Prize consists of 4 major components. First, the main Holberg Prize is awarded to excellent scholars in the disciplines covered by the prize, which are the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. One of the main ambitions of the Holberg Prize is also to inspire young scholars and to promote dialogue across different generations of researchers. The Niels Klim Prize is therefore awarded annually to a young researcher being from or residing in a Nordic country. The prizes are awarded by the Holberg board on behalf of the University of Bergen and on the recommendation of academic committees, which consist of outstanding international scholars in the relevant academic fields. For the Holberg Prize of next year, we strongly encourage nominations to be submitted through the website of the Holberg Prize until the deadline of the 15th of June 2025. In addition to these prizes, we also have established the Holberg Prize School Project, which is an annual research competition for students in the upper secondary schools in Norway. Finally, the Holberg Prize hosts and organizes the Holberg Debate, an annual event inspired by Ludvig Holberg's intellectual curiosity, aiming to explore pressing issues of our time. Please check out our website for further information. Through these activities, the Holberg Prize aims to demonstrate the continuity of knowledge system from pupils and teachers in the schools, the students, young researchers, and the international intellectual, and further into living public debate. Today's event marks the end of the Holberg Week, the culmination of a long string of seminars, lectures, and celebrations held in Bergen in the past few days. It has indeed been a great privilege to spend these days in the company of our esteemed, our amazing laureate, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She will now join Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor of Global Culture Studies at the University of Oslo, in conversation on the topic Learning from Below. Thank you to the House of Literature in Oslo for hosting the event, and I'm looking very much forward now for this last conversation. So please, Bodhisattva, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Gayatri and I have decided that this conversation will be in Bangla. Because the front row understands Bangla, and that's the important.
That's the important row.
So, Gayatri, it's really an honor to be here in this conversation with you. I have read your work for pretty much my entire career. So,
I've written my work for pretty much your entire career.
So I was intrigued by the title that you chose for this talk, Learning from Below. And of course, I think everyone in the audience is familiar with the concept of the subaltern. And there is a thread here, a theoretical thread here, connecting the idea of the subaltern to learning from below. So I was wondering if you could tease out some of those connections for us, both the notion of learning and from below.
Very nice. Good question. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with the concept of the subaltern, because I actually stick to Gramsci's concept. It's simply, in English, small social groups in the margins of history. This is Antonio Gramsci's definition of the subaltern, and I stick with it. So not every suffering group is a subaltern group. Subaltern is a position without identity. It's not really people. It's a position with no access to citizenship rights. The subaltern is not generalizable. So a group from Stanford was going to, Marilena Chaui told me about this, was going to go to Brazil to work with the rural subaltern. Something happened, some natural disaster. So they were stuck with the urban subproletariat in Rio. And they used exactly the same methods, which is absolutely wrong. Because according to Gramsci's profound understanding, one of the problems with subalternity, the reason why it's not a concept, is because it is not generalizable. I used to have schools in one district of West Bengal, my home state, in Purulia, subalterns, and then I moved to Birbhum, not generalizable. The same small, because as you know, West Bengal is a very small state. In that small state, you move not even 200 miles, not generalizable. In Algeria, for example, when I was working in Algeria with the socialist women, you go from one village to another, not generalizable. By trying to insert the subaltern, and today, of course, the voting subaltern, the largest sector of the electorate, into the acknowledgement and rights of citizenship, you make them generalizable. See, this is Gramsci. And the idea of learning from the subaltern, let's put below aside for a moment, learning from the subaltern. See, this is absolutely, I mean, you hit it on the head. This is absolutely Gramsci. Gramsci transforms, Gramsci's project, he was not able to fulfill it because he died in jail. But and I think there are some changes he would have had to make, so I take the theory as loose and open because they were just notebooks, not books. At any rate, Gramsci's project changed the Hegelian notion of master-slave to master-disciple. Badly translated, you won't catch it in the Quentin Hoare prison notebooks. But if you go look at his own text, Gramsci's text, you'll see that this is the fantastic, Gramsci was a very smart man, fantastic student, etc., not just a good politician, but a very smart man. So what he was doing, he was saying that to produce the subaltern intellectual, the new intellectual, namely you and I, the new intellectual has to become a permanent persuader and has to be a disciple, not of the subaltern. Gramsci was not a romanticizer, but of the subaltern environment. What the phenomenologists, French phenomenologists would call the situation of the subaltern, as in a master-disciple relationship. So this transformation, it's a very hard thing to do, to change. See, all top-down philanthropy keeps the master-slave dialectic more or less unchanged, which is why good change doesn't happen. Whereas Gramsci's idea was to change the mindset of the intellectual. The intellectual becomes a disciple. And instead of romanticizing the subaltern, oh, I'm doing so much good, no. Instead of thinking of the subaltern as the teacher, his or her teacher was the environment of the subaltern. You would have to know it well. So this is my answer to your first question. You see, this is how Gramsci relates to the idea, and therefore, of course, I don't just say learning from below. Say learning to learn from below. It's very hard because the romanticizing do-gooders will say they know what they know what they want. We should listen to them. It's nonsense. If they really know what they want, then the centuries of historical crimes that we have committed against them and killed their cognitive machines, that didn't have any effect. That isn't true. It's a nice Christian point of view, but it isn't true. So to take the responsibility of our own historical crimes, we should acknowledge that they are not in a position directly to tell us exactly what they should want. They can certainly say, we think this is what we should want. But without any intuition of the public sphere, it is not possible in 2000 and whatever it is now, 25, it is not possible to actually know in that way. So you learn, as Gramsci says, from their situation, and that's what you really are there to learn. So that's why I say, learn to learn from below. You know, I'm the daughter of extraordinary, plain living, high-thinking nationalist intellectuals, deeply anti-casteist, deeply influenced by the very early Ramakrishna movement. My father was initiated in 1920 by Ramakrishna's wife, and my mother's grandfather was Ramakrishna's doctor. So that early movement was very different from what it is now. And in that context, in bringing up all the children like proto-feminists, what do I know? Metropolitan Calcutta girl with extraordinarily fine parentage, upbringing, a lot of education, so-called institutional education. I don't know how to learn from below. So this, what I say in the Gramscian way that you indicated. So I say, learn to learn from below. And I still haven't learned. I still make mistakes. See what I'm saying? So, thank you. This is a good answer. Let's go from here.
Thank you for that. So it's almost a century since Gramsci. And we are in 2025. And of course...
2060, yes.
Yes, well, thinking about learning to learn from below and so on, I think it brings up a question of what we have in society right now. Right? You mentioned the subaltern environment, and I was thinking of, well, populism. Populism and democratic backsliding, that's one of the biggest challenges and problems we have right now. In fact, in many countries of the world, populations are split pretty much down the middle, right? And that immediately brings up the question of, you know, who is the below, who's the above? How do we learn from these processes that are happening? So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on specifically populism and the notion of below?
I think my thoughts on populism would be very like yours. I don't think the people of populism, you know, Nadia Urbinati wrote a fantastic book called They, the People. See, the people of populism is a faceless mass, not identifiable as a collective made up of individuals. So, and that really has, although they are also quite in an unenlightened way, individualistic. I, that's a different thing. I'm not that interested in populism, of course, because it's not something that I can sympathize with at all, in the name of the people, to destroy all possibilities of social justice. This is not my idea of the work I do. And populism, since it's generally speaking electoral populism, you will agree with that, it is in fact very deeply tied to an instrumentalized structural view of social formations. It's as to what it's instrumental for, what the end is, that differs from populism to populism. In India and the United States, it's not the same. That is somewhat historically dependent. But the kind of work that I'm interested in, and perhaps capable of doing a little bit, is textural, not structural. Structural, in fact, good structural reform is very necessary. As a socialist, I have to be able to think so, right? But the structural work cannot be maintained unless there is a whole community of what Gramsci would call the new intellectuals who are texturally attached to the people for whom a just society is imagined. And what is it to be texturally attached? First of all, as I'm describing this to you, it doesn't mean much. So you should be aware that textural attachment is in the doing, and it is extraordinarily difficult to do. Now I'm going to talk about something which most of you in the audience don't know how to do. If there are people who actually know how to do it, then I'm very pleased, which is darning, textural repairing, right? So if you know how to do it, then you know that if in the fabric there is a tear, what you do when you darn, or invisible mending it's also called, you start a little bit above the actual tear. And with your needle, you begin where the fabric is okay. You begin to use the needle as if you're weaving. You turn the thread into a warp, right? And here's the woof of the thing. So you go on doing that until by the time you approach the tear, you are going to weave into the tear. And that's how the tear will be mended, ripukara. This is how one darns, right? Textural involvement is like that. You have to really have an infinite amount of patience in order to be able to insert yourself into the structure of desires, the texture of desires of your student group and their guardians and so on and so forth, the subaltern group. And then slowly attempt in that way to mend the historically broken fabric of social justice. Now, this is a very difficult thing to do. A structure is not that hard. It is still hard. You have to fight bureaucratic fights. But so this is what my attempts consist of. My attempts consist of the textural engagement. And not everybody has to work like that, but that's my way of working. See, so that's how I relate to populism, which is boldly structural and a kind of false self-identification. You know, I mean, the MAGA people, Make America Great Again people, they all believe that that's who they are. You know, no MAGA left alone. Remember, as Trump is pardoning. See, so there is a personality type which is totally fake, but it is accepted as a personality type, MAGA type. You understand? I'm a MAGA. That's nothing. Make America Great Again, right? But that's really completely unlike the textural commitment, where each person's textural makeup at the same time. This is also, it's hard work, because this is also, you have to remember also that these individuals will make up a collective. And yet you have to be very aware of the individual texture. So you're asking excellent questions, but therefore the answers probably will seem very abstract, because these are only really tasted and tested in the doing. Tasted and tested in the doing. So if you really want to see how it is, come work with me. But for that, you will have to prepare yourself a great deal, because the first step is to know that you don't know. You don't know. I didn't know, because I was muscle-bound with too much education, institutional education, and yet couldn't, in a romantic way, just let education go. It's a tough but extremely happy-making work, even as you're failing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we go back to Gramsci in that sense, right, with organic intellectual as well. One thing that, so I work and I'm part of a group called Co-Futures, where we work on contemporary futurisms movements from around the world. So we have a whole
Contemporary what movement?
futurisms.
Futurisms.
And this is the other side of MAGA, if one wants to think of it that way. For instance, Afrofuturism or indigenous futurism. I mean, there's Desi futurism, Gulf futurism. There's all kinds of these futurisms.
And they're diverse.
Absolutely.
Ungeneralizable. There's Gramsci.
Yes, which is also why they're constantly splintering into new futurisms, right? Now, the interesting thing about them is that they are also aesthetic movements. So there's Afrofuturist art, there's fashion, there's music, and so on. They're also political movements. So these are also ways of building a certain collective identity, a certain generalizable collective identity, perhaps for the sake of, well, electoral power or for the sake of social justice or reform and so on. They're also social movements. So they combine the aesthetic, the political, and the social in the same kind of package. And, well, pretty much all these movements also have a certain notion of learning, but also non-generalizable learning in a way built into them. For instance, indigenous futurisms. Who counts as indigenous? How do we think about indigenous ways of knowing, right? And how can we communicate those ways of knowing? And I think that these are questions that are also not just important for us in the group, but also something that I think we would love to hear your thoughts on, and I'm sure the audience would as well.
Good. The idea of a future, it's not, and the idea of an ism, that is to say, the ability to think collectively about the level at which I work, these are not yet accessible. They have been historically destroyed. I think it's very important that you folks do what you're doing at the level that you're doing, because unless those kinds of movements exist, we can't really refer back to something. But among my students, see, any place that I have gone, I have introduced wage labor. Before that, it was just hourly wage, right? So the transition from feudalism to capitalism is happening because I'm entering the space. I learned from my mistake, in Birun, this is what destroyed the whole thing. And so when I went to where I am now, which I won't tell you where it is, because I don't want visitors, but they destroy the work, and there's no place to live anyway, because I live with them, right? But anyway, where I am now, I knew that this had really harmed. I didn't think about the fact that as I was entering, you can't see any factories there. They hadn't seen any factories because Durgapur is the closest, and they don't go that far, right? So the only factory they had seen was Muri factory. I'm not even going to explain what Muri is here. It's useless. It's not a factory. But
they actually have Muri in Norway, the rice puffs.
It's not exactly rice puffs either. No, kind of Muri. You can't do a kind of with Muri, okay? Let's hold it there. But anyway, so therefore, I mean, and it just didn't occur to me that that's what I was doing. I was making this tremendous change, and without any kind. Mind you, it was a CPM, Communist Party Marxist area, but that didn't mean anything because that's just a party. When I told them about the theft of surplus value, said, "Oh, Didi, why don't you write a book about this in Bengali?" I said, "This is well known. Don't worry, your party people know about this." But at any rate, in where I went, the very first day, we have a feast on the last day of our visit, right? And because they're so poor, in Birhum, where they're slightly better off, about 30 people would come for the feast. The men would cook, the women would eat. It was very nice. Here, where I have my schools, 250 people turn up because they don't get enough to eat, okay? So I have to really do a huge kind of nemonton, a huge kind of feast, and they all eat. But before it, I talk to them. And the first day I said to them, by the way, just as you get hourly wages, gotor khatar mojuri, in the same way, and so I could also explain the difference between intellectual labor and manual labor, that they're both labor, to say that that the ruling class does intellectual labor. Very simple in Bengali. So first row, just listen. Boro lok matha khatai. Very simple. Khatai makes the head work. I mean, anyone understands this sentence, whereas the intellectual labor sentence is not so easily comprehensible. And then choto lok, which is a term of program, generally speaking, you don't use that word. Little people, but it actually means riffraff, nothing. So, choto lok, gotor khatai. The very poor, they make their bodies work. And so I explain that I'm trying to teach your children how to make the head work, because you're not allowed to think about this. And so, just why am I saying this? Just as you get an hourly wage for bodily work, manual labor, in the same way I'm paying an hourly wage for intellectual labor. But because I live so far away, I give the whole 30 days together, so that they don't have to think about salary, because this is the mistake I made, because they had no concept of salary, all mojuri, no maina. And so from that point of view, this is an area which is not yet capable of thinking or having an ism or thinking futures. It's a very good thing that you've brought up, because that is a place where we can think of indigenous ways of thinking. And there is Joy Goswami is supposed to be doing stuff with the Santals. But he's a wonderful poet, but he is not able to make this jump, to think people who are equal to me. I have one vote, so do they. I'm an Indian citizen. But they cannot think future. You see, I was talking in Bergen about a subaltern time, which I tried to give to the artists at the Shanghai Biennale. They couldn't really think about it. If I had it, I would read the quote to you. A time without past, present, and future, where the present covers it all. This is a place where a different kind of effort has to be made. There isn't, and I congratulate on what you folks do, but it's something that can help what we do, where there is nothing. Nothing, not even, nothing but, as I'm quoting Coetzee's Lucy, but there's nothing. I understood this once I began to move away from self-confidence. You know what I mean? That's how it is. I would like to know more about what you folks do, but that isn't where we can go yet.
Yeah.
And anyway, I mean, the main talk that I gave here, Imperatives to Reimagine the Future, it is necessary for us to revise profoundly any idea of future that we have had in the last few centuries, certainly since the bourgeois revolution, as is said, the Bürgerliche revolution, the citizenly revolution at the end of the 18th century. Times are different, so that the future is no longer a horizon, as I said, it's a porch. So anyway, let's get away from that one and have another question.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the talk that you gave earlier in Bergen, and I was also thinking of the power of humanities, right? Because that is something that does concern a lot of us, and humanities are under attack everywhere, right? And including here in Norway, and of course a lot of a lot of the target of this form of thinking is, of course, the usefulness of humanities or the utility of humanities. I think it's it masks deeper problems. I don't think the disciplinary divides are really that strong, right? But nonetheless, we should train our engineers or our STEM scientists, And one of the funny things that I saw in the news, this company that just went bankrupt, they were an AI company where it turns out that they were actually engineers sitting in India. So AI is artificial Indians or actual Indians sitting somewhere, right? So the whole hype behind it, the whole extractivist idea behind it, and also the whole solutionist mindset behind it, right? That humanities can't solve big problems. Humanities can't solve climate crisis. It can't find us a cure for cancer, right? But I think that does mask more essential problems in which I think humanities has the power to critique, right? And I was wondering if you could tell this audience a bit more about the power of humanities and how that features in your work.
Let me begin in a very practical, negative way, okay? I was talking to our ambassador, the Indian ambassador, a very charming man, I must say, last night at the dinner. And I said to him that today the humanities have become so self-trivialized. The way the humanities are taught, I can't say that I just support the humanities. It seems to me that a great deal has to change about how we use the humanities before I can say the humanities are powerful. They can be powerful is about all I can say. And remember, I became a tenure-track assistant professor in the fall of 1965. So I've been teaching, and I'm still teaching full-time. I've been teaching for 60 years, a long, long time. So I'm really speaking out of experience in terms of humanities, and I'm very old-fashioned. I think literature and philosophy as the Greeks thought of literature was not taught, of course, but they had a concept of poesia which was not like poetry. It was as to exactly what it was. It's something to discuss. Marx certainly knew what it was. It was a classical jurisprudence PhD, right? But at any rate, so in terms of the power of the humanities, it's something that we have to learn to think about. So that, as what I say is that it's because, I'm asked by ministries to participate with them here, there, and everywhere. And what I say is that you have to think that the humanities, which have an epistemological task, changing mindsets, the mindset with which we use STEM and AI and so on, so that it becomes medicine rather than poison. You have to know the dosage, and that's the humanities, practice of learning. Unless we do that way of teacher training, unless you think that this is as important as defense, nothing is going to change. So this is somewhat of a negative thing to say, but a practical thing to say. And therefore, in fact, I work with younger people because I'm 83 years old. It's not something that one hears much. Humanities are being closed down. But I also say something that you undoubtedly have heard me say, but I think it's worth repeating. At my university, for example, the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, brings in between $9 and $19 million a year. The humanities don't bring in money. They have to be supported. Therefore, as you know, let's just trivialize the humanities, turn away humanities teaching into initiatives, meaningless talk, and so on. And I always say the same thing, which is somewhat disliked by the fashionable critics of biopolitics. And this is, you can't call on support from the very hardcore theorists. And so so I say that, look, humanities are like healthcare for the society. Do you expect healthcare to pay you? you have to spend money on this. So therefore, you don't even think that the humanities will produce money for you. That's not an understanding of what it does for society. What it does for society is not produce money, but produce something very much more, that pharmaceutic idea of turning poison into medicine. Otherwise, the more advanced you are in terms of cyber stuff, for example, the more cyber crime increases, the more you have to make laws and penalties and so on. And the more, therefore, loopholes are found. Law enforcement means come find some loopholes, how to break the law. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is separately, to train the soul slowly so that it will not want to use these things in this way. I hesitate now to say anything. I think STEM is absolutely necessary, especially since now in the United States, even the poor STEM people are getting beaten down by our intellectual king. But at any rate, so it is. But how to use STEM is what the humanities teach to an extent, so that it's the production of a general will for social justice by the practice of, in the literary way, the practice of resisting self-interest and moving into the other space. That's how you read. That is what is taught in the humanities, literature and philosophy, all kinds of philosophy except the analytic. Analytic philosophy is a very interesting thing, but it absolutely takes away the necessity to question the philosopher. I mean, go read Nussbaum and Rawls. You will see that there is absolutely no questioning of the person who philosophizes. And that way, so you see, yes, humanities can't solve problems. And that is something, that is a lesson that we all should learn from Frederick Douglass. And I mentioned the name Frederick Douglass to Maori activists in New Zealand. And of course they see, I'm an intellectual, I'm a university professor, I'm a this, that. And so they say, well, we don't read academic authors. Frederick Douglass, born a slave. And so Frederick Douglass at the time of emancipation told us that this is when the problem begins. When you think you have solved the problem, that is when the problem begins. That's a piece of absolutely good advice. And that's what I was talking about in my talks in Bergen, about very simple. I mean, one of my students, Ritu Bila, she used to call me Ms. Supplement. And I think it's a good name she gave me. When what is it to supplement? To deny that anything is total. The solution of the problem is the total solution. The supplement says there is a hole in your totality, because there must be a hole. That's the contingent. It is, otherwise it's totalitarianism. As time changes, the system changes. And so the supplement discovers the hole, but then has to learn exactly the shape of the hole, the ethics-shaped hole in socialism. And then, through the generations, try to fill that hole as well as possible, never perfectly. So humanities, in this sense, is absolutely necessary, because it makes no truth claims, the humanities. It's unverifiable. So that all of the social sciences, when they have a humanities component, they're still different, because they must make a truth claim. Historiography can't not make a truth claim. But to know that the truth claim has to be generationally supplemented. Rawls, in his book, writes, now at last I have found the perfect solution. I say, oh no, you should be embarrassed to say that, man. What happened to you? So to an extent that, and he shows his revisions. Come on. I mean, was a very smart man. I mean, I'm not as intelligent as he is on the other, and certainly not as learned and all of that stuff. But that's what we can do. We can show people much smarter than we are how to be smart. You understand? That's the practice of learning, you know. So therefore, of course, we don't solve problems, because solving problems is a problem. You know, that's what we can tell the politicians, that when you think you have solved a problem with a policy, start to think, what is the problem with the solution? That's how social justice moves. See what I'm saying? But before I get completely overwhelmed by your question, you ask me another one.
Oh, I was actually going to ask you something that you just said, the ethics-shaped hole in socialism. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that. And also the notion of the supplement, of course, because ethics, the understanding of ethics, at least within certain religious formations, is that it is a total thing. It's a total, final, solved issue, right? So where would the question of justice also fit in?
See, this is why religions must be brought to crisis. Religions can be extremely useful. I mean, I'm not a believer, but on the other hand, I was talking about this in Bergen, so my friends from Bergen will hear me repeat this, but again, it bears repeating. One must think about the transcendental and the supernatural. We are speaking in English, and therefore I'm going to do it in English, but it is possible. See, you know, I translated Derrida, and I found him very interesting. He was certainly a very committed, careful thinker, and he talked about this business of the ethical. And when he talked about the ethical, what his point was, are we going to take the ethical and make it simply part of our intention, that is to say, doing the right thing? Or are we going to acknowledge that the ethical, which, you know, you are a Bengali, what we call ahoiteku prem, unconditional ethics. It's not about, let me judge what the situation is and choose the right thing to do. That's not a bad thing, but that's a moral decision. And there is a difference between what you and I can decide about the right decision to make, and we should do it. And the acknowledgement that the ethical is bigger than just what our perception of right and wrong can give. Now, socialism, the problem, I mean, the reason why I say it's an ethics-shaped hole, I'll go to Marx, and I have mentioned this also. It's absolutely obvious that you restore the ownership of the means of production to the worker. I mean, today, of course, the working class is not the agent of emancipation, but we're talking about socialism. But when one thought that the working class was, since industrial capitalism was the big thing, what was the project? The project was, as one sees in Capital Volume 1, to make an epistemic change in the working class. What epistemic change? To think that they are not victims, but agents of production. It's all over the place in Capital Volume 1, again and again and again. That's number one. And number two, constantly he's telling the working class that do not think about private suffering alone, private labor alone. Think of transforming what we call quantification. Think of the abstract average of everyone's labor added, and then, you know, it's like a stream. That's labor power. That's what the capitalist borrows from you, not private labor. And again, since as a ruling class ideologue, bourgeois ideologue. Marx is full of sympathy for private suffering. And so again and again he comes back, and Capital One, you know that this is the structure. Again and again he undoes his argument by sympathizing with private labor, because he can't just give this lesson. But this is the lesson. Try to learn to think of labor as a continuous average, because that is labor power, and that's what the capitalist borrows, and it is with that that you'll fight capitalism, okay? This is, I mean, I'm just doing Socialism 101, but nonetheless, since you asked me that question, I have to sort of go through it a little bit. So therefore, the idea then happens that if you have ownership of means of production, then you won't steal the surplus value, but you will keep as much as necessary for building social justice, and you will take as much as necessary for your subsistence. In other words, he assumes that with this lesson, the working class will change epistemically. They will become good. Sorry, that's where he made a mistake. We saw that that does not happen. Just restoring the means of production to the working class does not lead to social justice. That's the ethics-shaped whole. Gramsci understood that. And this is good socialism. I'm not talking about, totalitarianism in the name of socialism. Gramsci understood that. So Gramsci writes that the project, Marx's project, is not psychological, not moral. He doesn't even say economic, but gnoseological. The Italian word is translated generally epistemological. And so then that's where Gramsci is different, that you actually have to produce the proletarian intellectual and the subaltern intellectual, each one of them capable of being a dirigent. It's a very different idea of education. And so it seems to me that's the whole. Bad socialism, in the name of socialism, state capitalism, and so on. There you can say it more easily. But what we really have to learn is that in good socialism, the ones that we in Calcutta in the 50s and 70s with Amlan Krishnan Datta and those wonderful older socialists that we learned, we went into electoral education, etc. It's a mistake there. The mistake is this one. And that's the humanities. See, so that's, Marx knew a great deal about this, but he made a mistake in the idea that this would happen. This doesn't happen without an incredible amount of textured effort. Doesn't happen. Union organization won't do it. That kind of supplementing vanguardism won't do it.
Yeah. I think this is one point I think we can take even further. One of the things that we have often discussed in our readings as well is the notion of planetarity in your work, and Death of a Discipline, 2003, and I was an undergraduate when I did that. So one of the things in there is when you talk about planetarity and you talk about, and this is an exact quote, the planet is in a species of alterity. And when we are talking about ethics and when we are talking about socialism and ethics-shaped wholes and learning from below and so on, so planetarity is, let's say, from 2003, and from 2005 onwards, we can actually follow this on Google Ngrams, right? A spike in the term Anthropocene as well, and environmental humanities. And there's a lot of concern about thinking with the planet and so on. The Anthropocene as a concept is everywhere, but also thinking with the planet, thinking with other species, post-humanities, and so on, right? So I was wondering where our notion of learning from below that you mentioned connects to the turn in post-humanities, and also to think with other life forms that do not partake in socialism, let's say. What is our relation to them in a way? And how do they fit?
I don't think you can think with other life forms. I think we should acknowledge that it is something that is absolutely necessary but impossible. So unless we have that absolute humility about the incapacity of the human, nothing will happen. It's another item of unquestioned human pride, unjustifiable and unintelligent, to think that we can think for species that are not human. No, we have to acknowledge the uselessness of thinking. That's not the project. The project is to work for rather than think with. If you try to be an actual small scope, that's all the scope that we can have, worker for planetarity, as it were, then you would know that pride, that vanity, that the vanity of human wishes, to think that we can think with the non-human, the post-human, etc., it's nothing but vanity. Any kind of practical sense will tell you that the instrument with which you claim this is in itself, you should leave it at the threshold if you are really thinking about. Number one is that. Number two is, of course, it doesn't matter, because the human is not nature. Anthropocene begins right at the beginning when... Have you read Christine Brooke-Rose's book? What is it called? The one with begins with S. What is it called? You know, the one where she gives the life of Subscript, where she gives right from the beginning in the voice of a cell. You know, she begins with the cell as human life is created. And then she ends with agriculture beginning between the two rivers, Mesopotamia. And that's where the book ends. It's an extraordinary book. And so this idea that when you do anything as a human being, you can make more than you need. Superadequation of the materialist description, definition of the human. It's right there. That's where love begins. That's where poetry begins. That's where everything begins, including capital. The difference between what the worker needs and how much the worker can make. The difference is surplus value. You steal it. Capitalism. So therefore, that difference does not exist in nature. Nature is adequate to itself. You cannot expand. You know, we learned this today from all of the environmentalists. The earth will not grow. We have to recognize the distinction between the superadequate human and nature as such, and that is where the Anthropocene begins with humanity, as it were. So it's not as if we can correct the Anthropocene by being just a little bit capitalist with smart capital. You know, this is the idea, what one has to, the species of alterity. I think I was wrong in that's not Death of a Discipline. That's the first thing on in Imperative to Reimagine the Planet, 1997, whereas this one is 2003, right? The Death of a Discipline.
Yes.
So there was the acknowledgement that, but I did say also that the planet, the planetary system, planetarity, is not continuous with us, just as it is also not discontinuous. So what I do, and again, one of the talks will tell you, what I do, very small, but I'm interested in spreading it so that other people want to do it. It is just talking about it doesn't do anything. What I try to do is to make my teachers and students recognize, just like Capital Volume 1, recognize that they're not just victims they have the responsibility for what's happening to the earth. And the general talk that I gave little videos to show how I try to do this, and how I have received from them a request which I at first misunderstood, that what I try to teach about feeling the earthiness of the earth, and so on, and the cartography of the world, and their responsibility, and so on, and that we are all connected, etc. They had wanted me to do it for the whole village, not just for the school. So, Didi, let's have it for the guardians also. You see, because they really felt that this is something that they should all know, not just the victimhood. And I didn't understand that that's what it was. I understood trying to write that essay for here. I said, that's what they were asking. I just sort of did it in a bogus way because I knew they had asked I should do, but it wasn't a good idea. But I have told them on the phone that I will do it again because I now understand what it was that they were telling me to do. So to an extent, to transform the so-called victims into the commonality of agency is one thing, but also to acknowledge that nothing will happen. So let's get into the question of religion very briefly. Very briefly, those are really wonderful words, aren't they? So that in the original 1997 essay, I talked about the fact that if one thought about the planets in this way, that we were in this planetary system which was indifferent to us, then perhaps this would go all the way from animism to the white mythology of post-rational science. So in other words, I was proposing a new kind of robust secularism which would take this idea which has to do with the transcendental rather than the supernatural. The transcendental being, very simply, that which we must assume in order to access experience from Kant, but this kind of idea is available in practical moral wisdom all over the place. So the transcendental, on the other hand, constantly moves through religious systems into institutional systems of belief. Belief is the least interesting function of the head, to believe. Ontological commitment of religion, nothing. So the idea is to de-transcendentalize the transcendental through imagination. That is, it's possible to do. And in fact, I gave the William James lecture at Harvard Divinity School quite a few years ago. And there I pointed at Sharada Muni Mukhopadhyay as a person who did this. I did a lot of research on her, an illiterate woman, but she had this sense of not the religious belief, but the ethical transcendental, de-transcendentalizing it through imagination. And when you de-transcendentalize, you're getting taught poetry. You're getting taught, Aristotle, poetry is more philosopheteron than history, and so on. So it seems to me that religion has to be coped with rather than through a European history of the Reformation and the turning around of the ecclesia and the seculum, religion transformed into something private, like going to the bathroom. It doesn't happen that way. The division of church and state, you can't divide the church that way. Then, you can't have the de-transcendentalized ethical. So to an extent, and that's why, government becomes nothing, or it gets tied to the Christian white imperative, etc., etc. It doesn't go away. We kill in the name of religion all the time. And so therefore, believe me, I am being brief. This is an incredible topic. I'll just say one more thing and then you can ask me something else. Therefore, what we must admit, and both Du Bois and Ranjit Guha admitted it, and also others, is that the religious for the subaltern is the only something like a public sphere. Because the subaltern has no access to what we call public sphere. And so, in fact, subalternity brings religion to crisis. And I pointed out in my other lecture that Du Bois's wonderful book on Black Reconstruction has a chapter 5, which is the coming of the Lord, which is how the, at that point the word is Negro. We don't use that word, but in Du Bois's book, so I'm quoting when I use the word Negro, that the Negro, the enslaved Negro, actually sees, it narrativizes enslavement and emancipation in terms of the Christian psychobiography, so that emancipation is the coming of the Lord. And animism doesn't have that because nature goes round and round, round and round, reborn all the time. But Christianity had a teleological story which they transformed into the story of emancipation. Now, the idea there is that Du Bois remarks that as a bourgeois ideologue, just as Marx described himself, he could not access this. That is also something that we have to realize, that the idea that religion is the public sphere, if we who are citizenly, bürgerlich, bourgeois, if we decide that we will use religion this way, it is socially impossible, social formation impossible. So therefore, we have to remember that religion is the only access to the public sphere for the subaltern, those whom we shut off from the public sphere, but it doesn't remain recognizably the religious. So it's a big deal here, but again, your questions are very, very good indeed. You're bringing out the difficulties in an argument, and so I'm talking and talking. But generally speaking, I don't talk much. So ask me another question.
I think we should open it to the audience.
Yes, one thing then I will say, supplement. If you supplement with gender, we didn't talk about gender, it is the dangerous supplement, because in the case of rights, everything is absolutely okay. Equal rights, women's rights are human rights. There you have to simply do an unexamined kind of activism. Absolutely, there's no question. You don't even have to think about it. But when you come to gender in this epistemological way, it is so, because violence can be desired. This is a very, very frightening thing. So that once you introduce danger as a supplement, it is a dangerous supplement. We have to be very respectful of the extraordinary range of gender. It is not just equal rights. And there, equal rights, 100% commitment. But we must absolutely acknowledge that it's not something that's just within our daily experience. Gender is much more complicated. My voice changes. Now ask questions.
So we have about 10 minutes, so maybe time for 2 questions. We have one over there. And if you could also please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Alex. I have a background from gender studies.
Sorry, Alex what?
I have a background from gender studies in Bergen.
You're a teacher or a student?
I was a student. Now I'm a teacher at the high school.
Good, good.
I was wondering if you could talk about the role of being a translator when you learn from the environment of the subaltern, how you translate what you learn into meaning, into something you can teach other people, how the environment becomes thought. Yeah.
Should we take more than one?
Yeah, perhaps.
Good question. I'm coming to it.
Hello.
Yes.
My name is Elodie. I'm a doctoral student in philosophy of education in Oslo, and working on the work of Jacques Rancière and the notion of childism. And my question relates to that. When you talk about the subaltern, do you make a difference between children and adults, or do you think primarily of adults?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, shall we take 2 or 3?
Let's take one more back there.
Jeg må ta det inn norsk. Jeg kan dessverre ikke engelsk. Jeg heter Eirik Myrhaug Partapoli, og jeg har en gave til deg fra det samiske folk. Jeg har forsket på en ny økologisk økonomi i 50 år, og de opplysningene vil jeg gi til deg. Og det handler om hvordan, det er noe felles med deg, hvordan fantasien kan misbrukes, og hvordan fantasien kan bli rett. Og det er gjennom at vi bruker det økonomiske symbolet penger feil. Derfor så kommer vi av veien når det gjelder økonomi. Og jeg har en helt ny måte, en ny regnskapsmodell, og jeg vil gjerne dele det med deg.
Okay. Did you understand?
Perhaps you want to translate?
Yes. And also who he is.
Yes. He has a gift from the Sami people.
Okay.
So
Oh, wonderful.
So very briefly translated, it's a gift from the Sami people, and it's also a book which presents a new model of thinking money and value, very, very briefly.
Okay, so let me begin with, thank you very much, let me begin there. Well, I feel a certain closeness to the Swami people because, books, yes, thank you. I will certainly take a look at this very carefully, very carefully. I feel a certain closeness because in 1992, I was invited by the Swami Parliament because, of course, I have been working for the Fourth World now for a very long time, for the indigenous. And when I went there, I was within the Arctic Circle in December. It was a wonderful, wonderful feeling, wearing ski underwear under my saris. And because, of course, out of respect for the Swami Parliament, I was dressed in my national costume. And as I was talking to them, what they asked me, and I will not forget it to this day, have you actually been here? Because what I was saying was so similar to their own suffering. And then I told them, because they were teaching me by asking that question, that the suffering of the Fourth World, the first world that was in the world, in the hands of what came later, was similar, that it was structurally similar. So that is why I have remained very close to the idea of the Swami, and I am able to thank you again for that first invitation, which was a wonderful experience, 1992. So thank you for telling us this. Now, as to what these new ways of thinking are, I am very critical about these things. I understand why these claims must be made historically by those whom we have not respected. But at the same time, since I think of them as equal rather than superior, we human beings are equal to each other. No one is better or nor worse in a general understanding of being human. Therefore, all claims to better solutions, that's where I began, respectfully are questioned rather than accepted. So thank you, and I can tell you that I will look at this very, very carefully, and perhaps, if my age allows, turn up with the Swami Parliament again. Thank you very much. Okay, now I wish I could talk more, but really I must stop here. And the idea of, am I thinking of adults or children? I'm thinking of the entire social formation. Subalternity, as I said before, it's not human beings, it's a position. It's the position of being withdrawn from citizenship, and it changes, because today the subaltern votes. This Gramsci didn't know. And so the idea of the subaltern now is the largest sector of the electorate. So that the subaltern who's denied the mind, these are voting age subalterns, okay? They, in fact, vote for tyrants all over the world, so that we are ruled by tyrants. And this is one, so therefore, it doesn't matter whether they're adults or children, because the children whom I teach, my project is, I mean, see, Rossier does talk a lot, but Rossier's experience is limited. You know, these are Althusser students, right? Etienne is more self-critical, not Jacques, and that's a kind of problem. I respect them greatly, and again, they're much more intelligent than I am, and certainly have read more, etc. I mean, that's not hard. The bar is low. But the involvement, this textural involvement with the rest of the world, where you don't even understand the language, these they lack. And Etienne is more modest. So therefore, I would say, work on Rossier, but look around him. You know, when he talks about the, whatever he calls it, the ignorant master or whatever, he doesn't really know the rest of the world. You know, he just talks about it. And that's something that you, as his student, should be able to question. But anyway, so therefore, when I'm teaching the children, why am I teaching the children? Because there you teach the intuitions of democracy as habit, and to form a pedagogy so that the intuitions of democracy can come into the children who will be voting. I talk about voting all the time. In fact, I wish I could show that voting stuff that they sent. They made these little videos for me because I told them I was giving a talk on democracy at NYU. Send me something, I said. And they made this stuff, and my teachers, and sent me one of a woman and one of a man. Very interesting, but we don't have it. But at any rate, so therefore, when I teach the children, I'm trying, my ambition is to try to devise a kind of pedagogy that would insert the intuitions of democracy as habit into the children of the very poor. Democracy is other people. How do you teach children of the very poor who simply starve when there's no more food to focus on other people? Because unless you can think other people, there's no democracy. So this is therefore the education of children who will be voting very soon. So subalternity as a position is within the structure of democratic behavior. Their distinction between adults and children is nothing. You just think of the fact that people, generation after generation, in most of these areas, let's say Turkey, India, etc., the Philippines, the United States, the election of leaders is in the hands of the largest sector of the electorate. It isn't a problem of adults. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm not I respect him, but I'm not very sympathetic with someone who's much greater than Rossier, Freire. Because he was too involved in the conscientization of the adults. You have to start and then move. So, as I just said, my own teachers from the community, the women, they have said that I should say this to the adults. So it's all mixed up. It's not you divide subaltern only adults, subalterns only children. It's not like that. Because subaltern is not a human description. He is not a subaltern person. You see, the subalternism becomes romantic primitivism. That's a mistake. It's not a description of human beings. It's not an identity. We are there to destroy subalternity and to put it into the generalizability of citizenship, while we question citizenship. And so that's, again, a powerful question, and I hope I've been able to give a satisfactory answer. Now, your question, Alex. No, I don't translate it into instruction. Because, and again, you have asked me a practical question, and please listen carefully. See, I'm talking about many years, right? I've had these schools now for 40 years. In fact, now, 41 years. And I've been teaching at an elite level in the United States for 60 years. Now, what you learn is that this kind of millennial historical crime, you know, colonialism is just a few hundred years. The caste system is a few thousand years. So this, and we are the ones who perpetrated it. I'm not going to correct it in my lifetime. It's so, this kind of millennial historical crime, don't even think about finding ways of translating and teaching. That is immediately, in spite of I could see that you are a very well-intentioned person, but in spite of all your good intentions, history will win. History is larger than personal goodwill. Remember this every day so that you don't think about, oh, how can I find a method? How can I translate this into, because you can't. You see, I teach, after all, the children of the superpower. The United States is much more in a superpower position than Norwegian students are. And they really will be able to perpetrate anything they want. And I have to tell them again and again and again, hold yourselves, hold yourselves. You have been harmed by your social formation, and the best way that I can help you is if we think together about why we must stop our ambition to make change immediately. They want to change the world, and they can, unfortunately. So this particular responsibility, teaching at the top and teaching at the bottom, has taught me to take your question very seriously and tell you that's not your task. Your task is simply to learn from your mistakes. You will be making, you see, to be able to acknowledge mistakes is a much more powerful practice than wanting to translate and change. So that's what I can tell you about method. Try to be able to acknowledge mistakes, because speaking as a Hegelian, you know, there are good mistakes and bad mistakes, productive contradictions and non-productive contradictions. Try to acknowledge the ones that you can use. So thank you very much for your question. I wish I could actually talk to you at greater length, because I would tie your hands. You know, so there you are. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful questions from you and from you.
Yeah, thank you. We have...
Oh, yes, so I'm a... Yes.
Then
It's all done, right?
we are done. Yes.